the Mug authors will talk about handling and including mature themes in content and mature content in our stories. Kind of what are our do's and don'ts? What have been our experiences in the past? What are some things to watch out for? Kind of best practices, and I think that's gonna cover our topic for today. I should have, before pressing the play button on this video, I should have determined who's going first. But instead, I'm going to pick on Louis because he looks awake, surprisingly awake, actually, more awake than he usually is at this hour.
At this
I
hour, yeah, this is
only,
only hour one. Oh my gosh.
so yeah, so what? Well, actually, let's. I guess I assume that since we're all part of this discussion, we all have mature content in some way we've experienced. Either considering using it in our stories or using it in our stories. But Louis, where would you first of all, what would you say when someone says mature themes and content? What do you think of? What do you think the average reader would think of?
Graphic sex. I think we've reached a point in this society where violence isn't really all that big of a deal anymore. We turn on the TV every day and we see another school shooting. So, I really think we've become kind of numb to a lot of that. So I think a lot of times it's graphic language and sexual situations and things of that nature. Which to be honest with you, whenever I was younger, I thought I was all edgy, and so I would put a lot of R-rated language in my stories. But the older I've gotten, the more I feel like it distracts me and distracts the reader. So I really don't put a whole lot of mature content in my stories. I write very little sex, and it's usually closed door kind of stuff. I picked up that phrase not too long ago from the romance people. Um, I guess what that means is when it happens, the door's closed, so we
Right.
can't see it, right?
Right.
Which is good because I don't want to have to write those scenes. Um, and I use very little R-rated language. The Johnny Hardwood stuff. I'm writing it like it would have been a book in the 1950s, and of course they didn't allow a
Mhm.
lot of that in there. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to keep it as close to that style of
Yeah. Well, one
content
of
as I
one of
can.
my problems with using a lot of expletives is I feel like if you're going to use some expletives in your story, they should mean something. They shouldn't be just
Yeah,
filler language. So if I have, say, I don't know, like a 20 or say a 30 or 50 episode story, there might be one F-bomb in that entire story, and usually it's a pretty dramatic situation that actually calls for it, right?
yeah.
But I agree with you. I went through the same period where I guess I thought I was being edgy and very real, very realistic by including a lot of foul language. And I just I got to the point where I'm like, well, why make these words into filler words? It just doesn't really add much to the story. So
I'll tell you where I will do it. If
yeah.
I'm writing a particularly folksy character, coming from Texas, that bad language just gets folded into
Mm,
the phrasings a lot of times. And I mean, you get one of these old guys just sitting out on his back porch with a beer, and I mean, he's not going to censor himself. So I mean,
yeah,
I would use it in a case like that.
yeah. That's
And
more authentic. Yeah.
yeah, I
or
mean,
or if like
I have one story right now, Gelatin Chi-Town, which in order to um, the bad language is used very specifically in that scene because the person who is being spoken to
yeah.
doesn't know who they are at that moment. They've had kind of their personality and their memories suppressed. And so the bad language is supposed to take them out of it's almost like a code word.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Because the person, when she reads, she loves super, super graphic sex scenes, but she hates bad R-rated language. So the R-rated language is like designed to like shock her,
Interesting.
into
Mhm.
yeah. But that's the only time I'm really using it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've noticed on television that uh, anything that's not on public, I mean, on network TV, just has all this language in it, and
Right.
some of it's just, I mean, it's not even realistic. It's like, oh boy, we can get by with this. Kind of like having 1X porn that they get by with.
Right.
The only thing they're not doing is showing you that the actors are not actually doing this, but they're making it look as much as they can like they are. You know, and I'm wondering if that's just I find it boring. You know, I never did think sex was a spectator sport.
Yeah.
You know, which is why I don't write romance novels. That and those are made today. I've been on the romance roller coaster 3 times and got burned all 3 times. And it's like, you know, I'm a slow
Yes.
learner, but damn.
I'm amazed at how much they draw out everything before it happens. Like especially on Vela, it's like a guy walks into the room and the woman's naked, and then there's 5 episodes pass where there's like a bunch of contentious dialogue. Because apparently that's the foreplay leading to the sex as they hate each other and they're like sparring verbally,
Yeah,
and it's
that's
just like
actually a trope. Slow burn, enemy
is,
to friends, enemy to
is that
lover.
what slow burn means? I thought it was just that like the
Oh, you
ro-
expected
the
it to be a plot?
yeah, yes, I did. I
Yeah,
did.
well,
Oh, well, okay.
Slow
I
burn
mean, as
can
near as I
involve.
can tell, I mean, I don't know. I read as little of that stuff as I can, but that seems to be what it's about.
Okay.
I mean,
You
slow
know,
burn
I mean,
can
I hate
involve
it, but
plot. I mean,
I thought what that meant was it was a slow burn toward them falling in love. Because I'm still of I guess I'm naive, but I'm still about romance should be about the people falling in love, not falling into bed. And I guess those two ideas are interchangeable now. Maybe I'm just hopefully old fashioned or whatever, but or
there's both
hopelessly, I
types.
mean.
There's both types. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
there's mixtures of the two. So.
Yeah.
I've actually have started putting clean, no romance on some of my things
Oh
when
my
I'm playing
gosh.
the games because I think there are people out there who don't want to read that. And they say, okay, here's something you can read that's not about sex.
Well, yeah, usually, yeah. I mean, there are people who will advertise, say, "Look, I'm only looking for clean romance."
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I know as far as those games go, there's a couple of very young writers. Um, and if I see them lurking around, I will not put anything on there that I find could be potentially
Mm,
objectionable. Because if
mm,
they stumble onto it, I don't want to be a part of that.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that kind of gets to the theme of, yeah, if you have some mature content. See, now I'm a little, I guess you could call me old school in the sense that I think it's very much of a kind of a double standard that sex is considered so taboo and so problematic, and then really violence and gore is just totally fine, and
Right.
like and
Mm-hmm.
and I remember as a kid, it's the movies I watched that had intense violence that really were for me much more disturbing, and that I think were a lot harder for or traumatic. So I don't know. I think it's interesting. I mean, and Lewis, you're definitely onto something. We're kind of desensitized to it, but I don't know. Is there an equivalent to just as you say clean romance? Like I've never seen, say, a horror writer say, you know this is a clean non-gore horror, like a non-gory horror. Like I don't know if there is an equivalent to the in the violence spectrum to
Yeah,
saying.
I don't know because I
Yeah,
mean,
I think
there's a
there
lot of
is.
good horror movies that don't have a lot of gore,
Yeah,
You have psychological horror, which
yeah,
right?
is
Yep.
is terrifying to me. Of course, I don't want to watch blood and guts either, ever.
yeah.
I had to quit watching Bones because it was just too gooey for
They
me.
were killing too many kids for me.
That
Mhm.
too.
Every other episode was the boy in the refrigerator or the girl in the sewage tank. I mean,
Yeah.
it'd be something like that. I can't handle little kids getting murdered on shows anymore. I can't stand torture either. I
Mm-mm.
cannot. You know.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're kind of getting to this point where, like, so adult when we're talking about what are mature themes and content. So obviously children getting killed, torture. I would say animals getting killed obviously is in
Oh,
that category. Like,
I'll shut off a show if you kill a dog.
yeah, oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
That's just all there is to it. That
Oh,
me too.
you're
Yeah,
mm-mm.
screwing the pooch whenever you murder a dog in front of
pun
me.
intended. Pun
Yeah.
intended.
Yeah.
So and it's interesting though because some of these. I mean, I assume these people exist. I try not to associate with them, but some people would say, oh, if the dog dies, like, oh, that's not mature content or whatever. But I don't know those people, and I would never
Yeah.
associate with such people. But it is interesting to me how certain there's certain things I think people easily agree on, the torture, killing of children, and then there's other content where it seems like there's a little more disagreement on what's considered mature. And I'm just wondering if you guys all think that is that playing into this rise in popularity of sensitivity readers, because it's harder for authors to know what's going to be considered mature or edgy and not edgy. Is that why sensitivity readers now versus say 20 years ago are, in vogue, so to speak?
I think the sensitivity readers are more about the handling of characters and situations that are not about cis white people.
Yeah.
The people
I
of
don't think it's
color.
about sex and violence.
Okay.
I think it's about
And I have noticed more and more trigger warnings at the beginning of an episode that says child abuse is
right.
in this. So if that's
And I've actually reached a point where I'm glad they do that, because if I see something about sexual assault or whatever, and it's just one of those days where I'm not feeling particularly strong, I'm not gonna. I won't read that chapter that day.
right.
Yeah.
So I think that we've, like so many other things, I think we're allowed to spread things out where, as a reader, I can choose whether I want to read blood and gore, or if I'd rather read somebody going insane, which to me is more terrifying than seeing them eviscerated. I don't want to watch the murder of children or dogs or cats, for that matter.
Or horses.
Cats,
I'm not a big fan of horses.
Eating murdered bodies, I don't have a problem with that. But if they're adults, I
really don't care either. I figure they deserve it on some
right, exactly. But to me, there's themes about. I know I've watched TV shows, even like Sesame Street. I will never forget they were using the talking about the long E on the end of words. I mean, the silent E that makes the vowel long. I know there's a word for that, but I can't remember what it is. I can't help it. I majored in English.
My mind is blanking.
So sorry.
There's the girl at the coffee shop, and Morgan Freeman was the guy, to give you some idea how long ago this was. And the woman says, "Boy, have I known some dudes who were duds." Now that is not aimed at children. But
okay.
And we're talking Sesame Street here. But
wow.
And that wasn't the only one, but some of the stuff at Sesame Street was aimed at adults, not at kids. And so there's very often there's two levels of stuff there where it's that's technically adult content. Because how many 6-year-olds would understand what that meant? And God forbid, I hope they don't. But there's such a thing as adult themes that are not about sex, but are about relationships, that are about. You've noticed how many TV shows now have this middle-aged person who has to deal with both an aging parent and a teenager, and how many people are dealing with that on a given day. Not to mention that you have shows that are actually about old people, some of which are not just about making fun of people being old, although most of those I find not to be very funny. But
there ain't a whole lot of that's funny about getting older. I am learning that firsthand.
Yeah. So, but anyway, that to me is another. There's a difference. I mean, all right, let's talk about addiction. Now that's clearly an issue in our culture.
And a mature theme, I would think.
And definitely a mature theme, although obviously there are kids who are addicted, but the treatment of that, rather than and the understanding of a person who, my brother was a drug addict. So, just to put that out there, which didn't make him a bad person. He made a lot of bad decisions, but he was not a bad person.
Right.
And, he went through drug treatment about 5 or 6 times, and he was smart enough to say all the stuff that he had to say to get them to let him out. That to me is an adult thing. And something that might be a trigger warning if you said this is about drug addiction. If you don't want to read about it, that's what this is about. And some of the stuff that I write about is drug addiction, but it's done in symbolism and other kinds of things. But one of my main characters in the new one is an alcoholic, and he's a guy that actually have a dimension called the higher dimension, which is where you go when you get high. And it's not always so easy to get out of there because two of the characters are going to have to escape from there. So,
See, that's a cool idea. That's taking something that is mature and in a lot of cases horrific and putting it in kind of a fantastical setting. And it kind of gives us it kind of illuminates the whole thing, because that's probably how they feel. It's like I can't get out of this world where I can't control my urges and stuff.
Well, and my brother wanted to quit smoking because he had COPD and he knew it was bad and all that.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't take the anxiety of not smoking. He could not handle the emotional impact of what you have to go through to get, and then, he got off of other things, but cigarettes are more addictive than cocaine, apparently. So, I mean, but that's definitely an adult thing.
They say something like that about cheese, by the way.
Yeah, they do.
I'm prepared to believe that cheese is as addictive as heroin.
I would believe that in a heartbeat because I'm living proof of it.
I know.
I could give up chocolate before I could give up cheese, and
I've given up chocolate. It's way easier than cheese.
Yeah.
Man.
I'm just gonna. One thing I want to address, in case there's anyone who watches this who's thinking to themselves, well, do we really need mature themes, or what if I just don't want to read any mature themes and I just prefer that? I think I would push back on someone who said they never want to read about mature themes, because one thing that I found in my own life, and since Charlotte shared, I guess I'm going to be a little sherry as well right now. So my grandfather was an alcoholic, and it was never something that anyone in my family would ever talk about, never something that people would share about. And so I think what people sometimes forget when it comes to mature content is if you thoughtfully deal with mature issues in your stories, that may be the only exposure, the only way to educate some people that they ever get. I mean, in their own families, that those issues might be taboo and never talked about. And so as a writer, we have like an opportunity to educate people, or at least expand people's minds and about the way the world works and how to deal with tough issues. And so I don't know, like I would say, mature content definitely has its place, and I wouldn't, I even if you're someone who's like, look, that's not my personality type, I think to grow as a person, like, mature content is almost necessary on some level. And that's not to say you have to, consume everything. Like I have a friend whose mother died of cancer, and so in stories where the mother has cancer, that triggers him. And I totally get why he doesn't want to read stories about that. But at the same time, I just feel like if you're a reader who's like, I'm just avoiding mature content, period, I think you're missing out a little bit on something too.
Well, and again, that's the reader's choice.
And I think too many people immediately think sex, and that's the only thing that is mature content.
Right.
But I don't see anything personally wrong with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 consenting adults saying, let's have a little, as they say in England, and I love rumpty pumpty. And I see nothing wrong or obscene or unpleasant about that, other than, arranging the combinations. But that would be fun. And so again, I would certainly watch and read that way before I'd watch somebody kicking a dog.
Yeah.
So again,
I would say it comes down to handling it tastefully or tactfully. When you're describing anything, if you go in on it, and this can be a rape scene, or it can be somebody getting drunk, or it can be an orgy, a rumpty pumpty, whatever you want to call it. It can be anything. If you get graphic with the language, I think that's probably more what's turning people off. Because I mean, let's go to one of the most famous preludes to a sex scene of all time, which of course is when Rhett snatches up Scarlett and takes her upstairs. We know what's happening. Only recently have we started to kind of analyze it and go, maybe that looks like dubious consent. But I mean, we know what's going on, but it's not graphic. It's not Deliverance, for example.
For sure.
and it's certainly not some of what we see on TV and film nowadays. I'll give an example of violence that was too much for me. The season opener of The Walking Dead, where they're all on their knees and the Negan guy is walking around talking about, one of you is dead, and I just basically haven't decided yet, but one of you is I'm gonna kill you in front of your friends. The actual violence was not horrible because it's done. You hear it more than you see it. It is the sickening feeling that you could feel amongst the characters, knowing that one of them was about to go, and that was what was too much. That was what was graphic, because it was a good. I can't even tell you how long that scene was, but it was bad.
I mean, that's like torture, really.
Yeah, and that is like torture. And that to me was worse than watching the guy get it. Because once that started, it was almost a relief, you know. And then that was too graphic. I pretty much at that point decided I've got to stop watching things like this on TV. I've got to stop supporting it because this is too much. We finally found Lewis's threshold. And, you know, watching a show like, say, The Last Kingdom, with lots of blood, lots of violence, the whole thing is about England and at war, you know, in wartime and all that stuff, and lots of people getting murdered with swords and pickaxes and, you know, whatnot. And that's graphic and that's bad, but it's not. But it's almost cartoonish after a certain point. You know, people get hit and, you know, the blood goes everywhere. And but I would call. I would say graphic in that way when you're being really over the top. That I think is where the objection should be, probably, or would be.
I agree with you. That's a great point, Lewis. Like I remember watching the Battle of Stirling from the movie Braveheart, and that movie is, you know, blood and gore, and yet that did not nearly bother me as other movies that, like you said, it's more the whole scene, you know, the whole what's going on in the whole scene. Like blood and gore just in the thick of battle, that's actually not, I can handle that. I don't think that's as, you know, scarring.
Him being tortured to death at the end was not graphic.
Yeah.
But it had an emotional impact. It was the scene beforehand when the woman is begging him to take something so that he's basically out of it when it happens. That was the more difficult scene. It had a greater emotional impact.
Definitely.
You know, and then you didn't have to be graphic at the end. I mean, yeah, it was pretty bad whenever they're pulling him up on the ropes and stuff like that. That was bad. But you don't see the other parts. When they pull the knife out, you know what's happening to him. But they don't show it. They show him from the you know, the neck up, and he's like that. Yeah. That's all you need. Nowadays, they would show the whole thing, and I mean, it would be just gross. And it's just, that doesn't register to me. That stuff is just blood and gore and yuckiness. And that's
the one other thing, though, that I'm just going to touch on this whole kind of interesting double standard one more time about the sex versus violence, because so I have a friend who she likes to read paranormal, and so she does not like explicit sex scenes, but she can read, say, Laurel K. Hamilton, and just especially the early books, which actually have, you know, a really good plot. I'm not gonna speak to the later books. Let's just focus. But you know, she can read those, and when she gets to a sex scene, she's like, oh, okay, you know, as Charlotte said, for her, it's not a spectator sport, so she just skips over that and gets right back into the story, and it's like not a problem. Yeah. Whereas for me, if I'm reading a book that, like Game of Thrones, and there's, to me, problematic violence or sexual violence, which is, you know, then
there's a lot.
I can't just skip over that and keep reading and still enjoy the book. Like, to me, there's a clear difference. I think people obsess and get way too hung up on explicit sex in terms of as mature content versus problematic violence and traumatic violence. And so I don't know if it's partly the puritanical roots of American culture or whatever it is, but we really get fixated on sex, and it just blows my mind the way Game of Thrones can be this huge commercial success, and I'm like, to me that's one of the most twisted stories I've ever read, and I'm like,
especially since it never comes to an end.
Yeah.
They don't even kill off the dead people. So
It's
I
just,
wanted to make a comment about that.
Yeah.
The kid, the one that falls and he's crippled.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And the way that the dwarf guy shows him how to still be able to ride a horse and
hmm
takes care of him, which nobody else is doing. Of course, his
Mm.
dad's dead. I forget what happened to his mom at that point. Seemed like she had been turned into a zombie or something.
Yeah.
I did read the books, and it was like, are you ever going to end an arc? I want to
Yeah,
find him and break his fingers.
Yeah.
But talk about violence.
Yeah, she comes back as some kind of shade type.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. But
thing.
the dwarf guy takes care of this kid and helps him to do what he wants to do. Now, to me, that is an adult theme. That is where one
Yeah.
adult is taking care of a
Mhm.
child, and somebody's taking responsibility for that child. I've been sitting here thinking about Huckleberry Finn. He's homeless.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly normal to him to be homeless. And the only adult that treats Huckleberry Finn like a human being is the Jim, the slave.
Right.
The rest of them treat him like, I don't know, they treat their dogs better than they treat Huckleberry.
Mm.
And I think
I would say broaden it even more, Charlotte. Any situation that involves anything that's kind of out of the ordinary. So like catastrophic injury or uncommon social status, so like your homeless character or the kid who's, been paralyzed. Yeah, anything like that. I would term that an adult theme, just like you're doing.
Yeah,
Sure.
in other words, an adult takes responsibility for stuff that needs to be done.
Yeah, right.
And an awful lot of the stuff that I see that's supposedly adult content is where adults are acting like teenagers on steroids. They're not acting like adults.
Yeah.
They're not adulting.
Well,
I feel like you're getting to the bigger point.
Yeah, which is, that's how not to do adult mature content, right? I
Right.
mean, yeah.
That's my opinion, for what it's worth.
That's a good point.
Gail,
So
you say you're okay with a lot of the sexual stuff, but I also noticed that you don't put a whole lot of sex and actually a whole lot of violence in a lot of your things. You tend to be pretty sparing with both.
I do. I think it makes a lot more impact if you're sparing with it.
I agree. Yeah.
it's just like with the 4-letter words. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's just like,
Exactly. Yeah. You don't really need to do that. But when you drop one in occasionally, then it really kind of grabs the attention. But yeah, I don't find describing the sexual act particularly fun or interesting to read about. Much rather participate.
I don't find it edgy. I don't feel like I'm pushing boundaries anywhere by writing about it.
It is so common and so ordinary for most of us. So yeah, I mean, y'all are obviously not incels, so I think.
Can women be incels, by the way, or is it just a male phenomenon?
Tangent alert.
Oh, is that a topic we shouldn't be?
No, it's fine. No, it's fine. I'm going to let Charlotte and Gail answer that because I obviously can't. So
okay.
I don't think of women in that situation as being incels. I think of them as being whiny little girls.
Well, if it's any consolation, we think those guys are whiny little boys.
They're whiny
Exactly.
Whiny little boys think they deserve sex.
Right.
For doing what?
I have no idea.
I don't understand their mindset that they're pissed at women because women aren't giving them the sex that they deserve.
What's deserve?
Who raised these boys? And boys are what they're always going to be too.
I could go slay a dragon, and I'm not sitting there at the end of it covered in dragon blood, going, "All right, who wants it?" Because that's not why I slew that dragon. I did it because that was the right thing to do. It was burning up the towns and all of that stuff. I'm not expecting some maiden to give up her virginity because
So getting back to Charlotte's point about like what makes good mature content versus crappy mature content, to me, it's also partly, what's the purpose of it? Is it there literally thrown in and you can kind of tell that the author thought, hey, this will make the story edgy if I throw this in here? Or does it actually add to the plot, the development of the characters, your understanding of the characters and their emotions? Like that's to me like the big difference, and so, and there are different ways to measure that. Like if as Charlotte mentioned with Game of Thrones, if they don't actually resolve any story arcs, to me that's a sign that they're throwing in their mature content just to be edgy and
For the sake
nasty.
of it.
Which
Yeah.
in my case, my response to that author would be "fuck you." Speaking of being edgy,
Mm.
but like, luckily we're far enough in the video I can throw in an f bomb.
Woohoo.
But like, so yeah, I think Charlotte touched on really how you can decipher bad mature content versus worthwhile mature content.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yep.
Well, it should be something that you're doing at the editing table anyway.
Yeah.
Does this move the story forward? That's the question you should ask with every sentence.
Absolutely.
Does this move the story forward? And if it doesn't, I don't care how juicy it is, you
Yep.
get rid of it. And a lot of people will criticize that statement, and that's probably people I don't want to read anyway.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Well, any
That's
other comments, or
controversial.
we can put a pin in this. I think we
Yep.
pretty much covered it pretty well, actually. All right. But of course, we'd love to hear comments from other readers, and we know this is a complex topic, so we by no means, are saying we have the definitive, say on what is mature content. But I think we all, I think we gave it our best effort. So, all right.